Hello, God's peace to all. I am the evangelist Gilson Gonçalves da Silva. I am a member of the Cathedral Assembly of God in St. Benedict Park, Belford, Purple River, January, Brazil. Church presided over by Pastor Daniel Source. It is now that you subscribe to the channel, leave your like or dislike, activates the Tinkerbell to stay by within our publications. So let's for the video. A king who grew rich and impoverished Israel, the sixth king of the kingdom from the north. The reign of Onrí reveals a context of crisis that goes beyond political issues, touching deeply the spiritual state of the people of Israel. A division of kingdoms after death. Solomon symbolized a fracture in the unity of the people and a departure the ways of God without unifying presence of a leader committed to God's law. Israel, they are vulnerable to influence and the idolatry that people have lost their identity and mission. Onrí ascended to power after a period marked by conflicts and betrayals. The spiritual cause of the kingdom was largely a consequence of lack of a leader who prioritizes devotion to God and obedience to his commandments. When the covenant God is not strengthened by leadership, the people easily succumb to cultural and spiritual influences of neighboring countries, many of which were strongly associated with pagan practices. A rise of honor therefore brought with the urgent need to restoration, but its focus, as history shows us, was more focused on the political stability than for the spiritual renewal of the people. The Ascension. Onrí highlights how fragility. The spiritual life of the people of Israel is a direct result of the lack of a leadership aligned with God's will. This transition period for Onrí provided an opportunity to bring the people back to communion with God, but his choice of prior to the political order and military at the expense of faith left the kingdom vulnerable to decay even more spiritual. The example of Onrí reminds us that leadership true in Israel has always been and is marked by faithfulness to God. The Bible, it teaches us in passages like the Psalm chapter 127 verse 1, "If you do not to build the house, in vain do they labor they build." That no prosperity material or policy can be attempted without God's blessing and direction. Onrí can political stability, but the history reveals that he failed to seek the divine guidance to guide the people of Israel. The rise of Onrí therefore serves as a powerful reminder: leaders and nations seeking their own way, away from the guidance of God, they become susceptible to the consequences of their choices, even if there is progress. The material and political absence of spiritual faithfulness inevitably leads to decline. The continuity of the reign of Onrí marks the moment when idolatry introduced by Jeroboam was firmly rooted in the culture and worship of Israel, when Jeroboam ascended the throne. Fearing that the people would return to Judah to worship God in the Temple of Jerusalem, he decided to establish an alternative worship system, placing golden calves in Bethel. And Dynasty was an attempt to ensure the Israel's political loyalty over promising the spiritual integrity of the people, turning away the hearts of the Israelites of his true God instead of leading the people to authentic communion. Jeroboam introduced practices that would lead to generations to turn away from the Lord. Onrí inherited this idolatrous system, and instead to seek spiritual renewal, chose to continue the sins of Jeroboam. In doing so, he sealed the fate of Israel. On a trajectory of idolatry, Onrí did what was wrong to the eyes of the Lord, a biblical statement which represents not only your actions, but also the intentions of your heart, your choice to perpetuate the cult of golden calves instead of worshiping the true God. It shows that his reign, he was moved more by the desire to keep the political control than by the pursuit of spiritual righteousness. Idolatry, it was a direct affront to the first and second commandments, which they worship God alone, and the rejection of idols. Exodus chapter 20 verses 3-5. With Onrí, the people of Israel continues to break these commandments. What brought consequences serious spiritual? The decision to honor not only did it solidify the system, idolatrous, but it also opened doors for that foreign cults were accepted and absorbed by promoting a culture of religious syncretism, which compromised the values and faith of the chosen people. Following in Jeroboam's footsteps, Onrí did not realize that the true foundation of Israel's faithfulness to God, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The story of Onrí, it reminds us that a system of worship which is not centered on God leads to deception and ruin. Just like Onrí led the people into error, The same thing happens in our day when we seek substitutes for God, the leadership that he ignores the Lord's commandments, doomed to leave a legacy of destruction and to distance the people. From the divine truth, looking at the reign of, we are reminded of the danger of spiritual traditions that we turn away from God. The continuity of Jeroboam's sin promoted by Omri. There is a need for leaders who seek righteousness and be willing to break cycles of idolatry by pointing out the return to God and worship true. The decision of Onrí to build and establish Samaria as Israel's new capital was a landmark important part of his reign, but also a spiritual turning point that would bring aftermath. The strategic location of Samaria offered an advantageous position, both defensive and commercial. A city situated on a high hill was a natural fortress and a symbol of the political power of Onrí. With the foundation from Samaria, he sought to strengthen the cohesion of the kingdom and consolidate its dynasty. However, what could have been a place of spiritual influence, it eventually became a center of rebellion. Then, in establishing Samaria, Onrí also opened the door to influence cultural and religious diversity of nations Israel, which, in constant contact with people's idolaters, began to absorb practices and beliefs alien to the covenant with God. Samaria became a meeting place between Israel and neighboring peoples, especially the Phoenicians with whom Onrí his successors sought alliances. Proximity has facilitated the entry of foreign gods, and with time it allowed pagan cults to they settled and prospered in the city. The choice of Samaria as capital politically and economically advantageous, it ended up compromising spiritual purity of Israel, as it distanced itself from values and practices that God ordered. The Bible tells us that Samaria, it has become not only a political capital, but also a symbol of idolatry and resistance to the divine commandments in Amos. Chapter 6, verse 1. The prophet condemns the safety of those living in Samaria, reflecting on how the people to accommodate in their cultural alliances and neglected the spiritual covenant with God. The external influences in Samaria, not only did they introduce new forms of idolatry, but also undermined the faithfulness of the people, who gradually no longer seeking God's will. He adopted customs contrary to his law. By allowing these influences, he realized that his search for stability politics at the cost of holiness, spiritual instability for the people of Israel, the city of Samaria became throughout the generations a center of resistance to the prophets, and a number of practices that profane the name of God. The leaders and inhabitants of Samaria saw the prosperity and political power as signs of success, but the remoteness of God had lasting consequences, both for the city and for the kingdom. The building of Samaria warns us about the danger of compromises and alliances, that material security is placed above spiritual faithfulness. Just like Onrí prioritizing political gains and military, we are often tempted to seeking stability and influence at the expense of our spiritual principles. The history of Samaria is a testimony to that, though alliances and prosperity, faithfulness to God is temporary. The true foundation of a nation, a covenant between Israel and Sidon, symbolized by the marriage of Ahab his son, and Jezebel, had a profound impact and enduring in the spirituality of Israel. This marriage was not just an agreement political, but also an open-door introduction of pagan cults, threatened the worship the God of Israel. Jezebel, being a Phoenician princess, brought with her culture and religious practices of their people, including the veneration of Baal, of the region's most prominent gods. The Honor's decision to form this alliance, it reflects a strategy that seeks strengthening Israel in the context of external threats, but also reveals a lack of spiritual discernment. The Bible is clear in warning about consequences of allying with nations that they don't like God, Deuteronomy chapter 7 verses 3-4. Onrí, by allowing this influence when he entered his kingdom, he was not alone. Faithfulness to God, but the spiritual future of Israel at risk, and Jezebel, with her strong influence, became an event for the idolatry in Israel, with the worship of Baal, and Zerah will quickly settle under your command, leading many Israelites to abandon the spirit to the Lord. An introduction of temples dedicated to Baal and the promotion of paid priests. The exemplify, as the enthusiasm true, has been renewed by practices that they offended the holiness of God. And in the first place, Kings chapter 16, verse 31, it is stated that Ahab made the which was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the footsteps of his father and accentuating the spiritual decay of the kingdom. Beyond the influence of Jezebel and promotion of the cult of Baal were not only isolated practices, they set off a fierce chase against the prophets of the Lord, as the prophet Elijah, who openly opposed this new religious order. The event of confrontation on Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18, is emblematic of the growing tension between the true spirit and practices idolaters who dominated society, the influence of Ahab and Jezebel. The example of Onrí, and later of Ahab and Jezebel, it illustrates how political alliances can have spiritual repercussions. Leaders have the power to shaping the spirituality of its people, and when this leadership distances itself from divine principles and consequences, they can be devastating. The history of Israel. It teaches that true prosperity and security does not come from human alliances, but of faithfulness to God, and of a genuine commitment to His word. As we reflect on the alliance between Finnish Jezebel, we are challenged to consider the alliances we make in our lives. We must always seek divine guidance and discernment influences that allow us in our heart and in our community. The story of Onrí and his successors are a warning about the impact leadership decisions can have generations, especially when it deals with issues of faith and encouragement. The reign of Onrí, though marked by a apparent political stability, launched the grounds for serious disruption spiritual, which would become more and more about his successors Ahab and Jezebel. Onrí's choice to continue and strengthen idolatrous practices inherited from Jeroboam had consequences that would affect not only your government, but the whole nation of Israel. The Bible teaches that the acts of one leader has a direct impact on the people he is the ruler, and he is no exception. This rule, the idolatry that has become rooted during the reign of Onrí, prepared the ground for an intensification of rebellion against God, especially with the rise of Ahab. A combination of the sin of Onrí and the practices introduced by Jezebel, it resulted in an environment in which the encouragement to the Lord was not only destabilized but often banned. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha, they were raised by God to confront this dynasty and denounce the spiritual corruption that permeated the kingdom, and Elijah in particular stood out as a spokesman for God, challenging the authority of Ahab and denouncing the idolatry of Baal. Jezebel imposed on the people the actions of Onrí. Therefore, they are not limited only to their overtime. They have passed on to generations. Following conducting a cycle of disobedience that culminated in grave judgments prophesied by God through Elias, God not only called the people to repentance, but also did a clear statement that the infidelity would have serious consequences. 1 Kings, chapter 17, verse 1, we see Elijah proclaiming a drought over the earth as a sign of judgment against idolatry, as a direct consequence of spiritual rebellion that began with Onrí. The Bible points out that God observes attentively the actions of the same leaders in the midst of the trial. He continues to offer booking opportunities and prayer. But when rebellion is disobedience becomes a norma, God also does justice. The sin Onrí served as a warning about the responsibility that leaders have before God, and His people choose to follow their own will instead of seeking divine guidance. The leaders not only harm themselves, but also lead their nations to a path of destruction. The legacy of Onrí. It is a powerful reminder that spiritual leadership should be exercised with fear and reverence of God. And history teaches us that the true greatness of a leader is not only in political achievements, but in faithfulness to God, and in the promotion of an environment where the attraction and obedience to God is prioritized. The impact of Onrí's choices. It is a call to reflection on how each action decision may reverberate throughout the time, shaping not only the present, but the future of an entire nation. The story from Onrí, it is undoubtedly a potent warning. The consequences of the search for power and political stability without divine reverence for God, more in the midst of tumult of the division of the kingdom and constant external threats, Onrí succeeded in many aspects ensure sigurança. As material threats from Israel, however, they didn't come without a high spiritual cost. And the Bible teaches us that true success is not just measured for wealth or for power, but for faithfulness to God and the fulfillment of your will. Onrí is remembered for his political achievements and by the foundation of Samaria, but his leadership is also marked by his refusal to follow the ways of the Lord. and he allowed the idolatry takes root in the heart of the people, continuing practices evil of their predecessors. In 1 Kings chapter 16 verses of 30 at 33, a narrative describes his son as one who has done more harm than that all who went before him. This it shows that despite its achievements, his legacy has been deeply affected by their lack of commitment to God. Spiritual lessons from the reign of Onrí are innumerable. First, in the remember the importance of leaders who have a heart turned to God. Such leadership not only guides people in times of crisis, but also establishes a pattern of spirit and faithfulness to God, who can influencing generations. When leaders stray from the pursuit by the divine will, morality and spirituality deteriorates. And in addition, the story of Onrí challenges us to consider our own priorities and choices. Often the search for success and safety can lead us to compromises that at first glance seem harmless, but that over the time can have repercussions devastating. It is essential that, as individuals and with humanity, we seek to God's guidance in our decisions, recognizing that He is the true source of wisdom and direction. Finally, the narrative of Onrí underlines the need for recovery and return to God, even in the midst of a leadership that if you always deviate, there is an opportunity of transformation and renewal. God. He continues to call His people, repentance and restoration. No matter how far they go, and stories of prophets such as Elijah confronted with idolatry, they show us that God always raises voices that cry out justice and truth, calling the people return to the path of righteousness. Thus, the lessons from the reign of Onrí are relevant to us, and today, they too evaluate our own lives and leadership, encouraging us to seek faithfulness to God in all areas. And only when our hearts are in accordance with God's will, we can really thrive, not just materially but spiritually, thus sustaining the life and faith of the people. In times of crisis, the spiritual legacy of Onrí, it is often remembered as an era of growing idolatry and spiritual deviation, and a period that paved the way for crises, deep problems faced by the people of Israel. Although Onrí has succeeded to establish a certain stability, political and material prosperity, its legacy is marked by bankruptcy spiritual that resulted from your choice to avoid the ways of the Lord. Idolatry that flourished under his leadership had consequences that they have lived for generations reflecting. The reality is that the decisions of one leaders have the power to shape the future of a people. Onrí's story serves us as a powerful reminder of the effects the ravagers of idolatry and disobedience to God. As we reflect on their actions, we are challenged to consider the consequences, allow external influences and improper commitments, enter our lives becoming even more dangerous. So when we get to the end of this video, we invite you to reflect on the deep message that the choices of Onrí, us broadcast. What we can learn from his story about the importance of remaining faithful to God's commandments, and that we can ensure that our decisions do not depart from the way of truth and the genuine spirit. That we hope so, as prophets who raised in times of crisis, may we have the courage today to confront the influences which we turn away from the true spirit and seek constantly the direction divina. Zayu was touched by this message and wishes to further deepen your knowledge about the stories that shaped our faith. Don't forget to sign up at our channel, leave your like, and activate the Tinkerbell to receive notifications of our next videos. Join us in this learning journey, and may we walk together in the direction to a relationship more deep with God. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.